Hello and welcome to Wood Stuff with Hutch. I am here today to talk about table saw safety. And that is a pretty hot topic on the internet. Safety in general, there's always critics out there. There's always people with their own opinions. And today this is geared towards everyone. We're talking about table saw safety specifically. It's also really highly geared towards the beginner. I know there's a lot of people out there who are just getting started. Maybe they've just bought some tools. Maybe they haven't even yet. For instance, one of my customers was actually saying how he likes watching woodworking for mere mortals and wants to buy his own shop for under $1,000 and get started. But he has no experience. He hasn't probably ever touched a table saw before. So in this video, I'm going to be talking about my opinions. These are the things that I've learned, that people have taught me, and that I've developed over time. These are methodologies and practices that help keep me safe when I'm using one of the most dangerous tools in the wood shop, the table saw. This video is not meant to be a critique on anyone else's safety practices. This is just what I do in my shop. I'm here every day working on the table saw, and these are habits that I try to force myself to utilize in all situations, whether I'm tired, whether I'm doing many repetitive cuts, whether I'm in a rush. And by forcing myself to do them, I feel like I'm keeping myself safe. These are my recommendations. And again, I'm not here to be the safety police of the internet. That's not what this is about. So, use your best judgment, but I hope you can get something out of this video. So, first things first, we need to set up our table saw properly. Now, how do we do that? Well, what we need to do is make sure that the blade is perfectly parallel to the miter gauge slots. Then after that, we want to make sure that the table saw fence is also parallel to the miter gauge slot, i.e. also perfectly parallel to the blade. Now, I have another video that I will link below that shows you how to do that quickly and easily without any special tools. So we're going to move forward, assuming that you've set up your table saw. One of the most important things that you can have on your table saw is a splitter. So what's a splitter? A splitter is a device that's at the back of the blade, behind the blade, that keeps the kerf open. Well, what's the kerf? The kerf is the space that the blade itself cuts in your workpiece. So the splitter not only holds your workpiece tightly against the fence at the back of the blade, but it also keeps that kerf open. So should your workpiece have some internal stresses and it wants to pinch the back of the blade, the splitter will prevent that from happening. This particular splitter is a brand name called the MJ splitter. Now, this works very well for any table saw that allows you to have a thick throat plate. And, at the same time, you're creating a zero clearance throat plate, which is great. But there are table saws out there, older table saws and smaller table saws, that don't have thick throat plates. So if you need a splitter, there are aftermarket splitters that are designed to bolt on behind your blade. Now, you may have to modify your throat plate to accommodate that, but that may be an option. If that's not an option, then I just highly recommend you find any way possible to put in an effective splitter. Doesn't matter how you do it. I've even used a little 1/8" brass rod before, but some kind of splitter is extremely important. So splitters help prevent what is called kickback. And there are two main types of kickback. There's the kind when the board gets lifted and it catches the back of the blade and the blade rides up the workpiece rides up the blade and it'll throw it back at you over the top of the blade. Now, the other type of kickback is when a workpiece gets pinched. It isn't necessarily lifted on top of the blade, but it gets thrown back directly at you. And of course, if anything or anyone is behind you, they could get hit. And those forces that are involved there with that type of kickback have been proven to be extremely dangerous. So you always want to be conscientious of who and what is behind you when working on the table saw. Now, the other thing to keep in mind is the use of a blade guard. Now, this is kind of controversial. You know, a lot of people don't like using it. They feel like they can't see. On lower end saws, they're made pretty cheaply and maybe actually inhibit the flow of work through the blade, and it may actually be more dangerous. But there are aftermarket blade guards, and you know, this one is a saw stop. I always plan on putting it on my saw and never got around to retrofitting it. But it's something that I really wish I did have. I don't mind working with blade guards. I learned how to use table saws for the very first time using blade guards. Once you set up your cut, the blade's going to cut where it's going to cut. You don't have to look at it all the time, even though a lot of people really feel safer that way and feel like they really need to see the cut. But I highly recommend a blade guard. And one thing that I think I want to do with my table saw, not only does it help with dust collection, but it obviously keeps your hands away from the blade, the whole point. And I want to get the kind that's an overarm blade guard, and it hovers over the top of your blade so that you don't have to worry about having to attach it down to the inside of your table saw. Even though I'm not using one, I do recommend using one and getting used to it. Now, as we continue on in our woodworking journey, we're probably going to start collecting more than one blade. And when we're changing blades, we want to make sure that we unplug the saw. Always do that first. That way, nothing can happen where you can accidentally turn it on. And of course, once you're done and you've reinstalled the throat plate, then's a good time to go ahead and just plug it back in. When working with the table saw, one of the principles that I think about when I'm using it is what would happen to my hand that's pushing the workpiece if my workpiece kicked back, or if all of a sudden everything in front of me, my workpiece and my push stick, all disappeared. Where would my hand be directed? One of the things I like to do is use push sticks frequently. One of the guidelines I live by is trying to keep my hands 4 to 6 inches away from the blade at all times, no matter what. So you may think, well, 3 inches, you could sneak your fingers through there and, you're not that close to the blade, right? Well, that may be true, and a lot of people do that, and I'm not here to tell people what to do. But for me, the way I like to work is anytime a board is 6 inches or smaller or narrower than 6 inches, I use a push stick. And so even though this board looks plenty wide to use your hands, personally, I just don't. But this is the design that I prefer. Now, why do I prefer it? One, it's because I have a positive grip that is pushing forward more parallel to the tabletop. So if this disappeared, the force that I'm using would be pushing more forward and over the blade and not down and into the blade. Now, the other reason I like this is because this provides me approximately 4 inches or a little more of clearance above my workpiece, which usually means clearance above my blade. So that brings me to another topic, which is blade height. So what I recommend for beginning woodworkers is having your blade height approximately 1/4 of an inch raised above your workpiece. I recommend that just because there's less blade exposed, and that's how I was taught, and that's how my high school shop teacher made us all work. Now, there are reasons to raise your blade higher above the workpiece, and I'm going to have that discussion in a future video, and that will allow us to kind of see what your thoughts are about the pros and cons of higher blade versus lower blade. And one of the other things that we want to keep an eye out for is warped boards that we're running through the table saw. One of the more dangerous kinds of warp is twist, this corner to corner wobble. Because what can happen is, if this corner is lifted up when it goes through the blade and then all of a sudden it settles down, you notice the workpiece is actually moving into the back of the blade. And that can again create this riding up or pinch factor that creates one of our two types of kickback. So it's recommended that as much as possible, obviously we work with rough lumber and sometimes, not everything's going to be perfectly flat. But another thing just to keep in mind is warp boards when we're running them through. If you can run flat boards through as much as possible, or at least keep an eye out when you're doing work with warped boards, that's something to really keep in mind. Now, what if we aren't using a push stick? Well, I go ahead and make sure my hand is close to the fence as possible, but also gripping in a way where my thumb and hands are not any closer than 4 inches to the blade when I'm passing through the cut. And also making sure that I put pressure against the workpiece to make sure that it's against the fence. Now, I don't always put this pressure here, but it is a good habit to get into so that before your workpiece gets to your splitter, you're giving it support against the fence. If your splitter's aligned in a good, accurate way, once it hits the splitter will be holding it against the fence. The other thing that you also want to be very aware of is what I call a death grip. Again, we're thinking about where would our hand go should there be forces that occur that are out of our control. And the death grip is, just using more pressure than necessary is what I'm referring to, because let's say I'm pushing through a piece that's a little closer to the blade, but still within our 6-inch range. Well, if I'm pushing it through, what if it gets the kind of kickback that pulls the workpiece over the blade? If I have a really strong grip, it's possible my hand could be drawn towards the blade. I only use as firm of a grip as necessary to push it through. Another thing that's really important to keep in mind is the fact that we only have so much distance in front of our blade. There's only, 12 inches of table on my saw. So what happens should we have a really long board? Well, one thing that we have to be careful of is making sure that it's safely, firmly down against the table. So one of the things we really have to be aware of with long pieces is the fact that we can tilt them up. Tilting them up again can create a situation that could cause kickback. If we tilt down and the teeth at the back of the blade end up catching the workpiece again, we can have a kickback. So that's just something to be aware of. Watch out for tilting on long pieces. And now I want to talk about the most common cuts, at least the ones that I thought of. There may be others, but the most common cuts that you'll be making using your table saw. And the first one that I want to address is the rip cut. Now, rip cuts are any cut that is going with the grain. Doesn't matter whether it's wider or shorter or whatever. Rip cuts are always with the grain, regardless of dimension. So when I'm making cut lists, I always make them with the thickness first, times the width, which I always use as the cross grain cut, times the length, which I always use as the rip cut or the with the grain cut. So at this point, we could start talking about different types of blades and what they're used for, because there are dedicated rip blades, dedicated cross-cutting blades. But what I've put on my saw for now is a combination blade, which can do both rip cuts fairly well and cross cuts fairly well. And I have a video about that I'll link to below to what this particular blade is. I really like it as a 1 blade, first blade for those just getting started. And another video that I will be talking about in the future are the different types of blades, what they're used for, when to use them, etc., etc. So for now, I've got my combination blade on there, and I'll just make a rip cut. So again, you'll notice on this narrow of a board, I used a push stick. But the other thing you'll notice is that I reached behind the blade for the offcut. Something that you really want to keep in mind, again, is where your hands are. In one of my videos previously, in my table saw setup video, someone commented that they thought I got awful close to the blade. Well, with the angle I was using there, it was hard to tell. You know, maybe I did, maybe I didn't, I'm not sure. But in any case, again, if you're, especially if you're short like me, you know, always be very conscientious of where you're reaching. And the other thing that I really want to recommend too is what your balance is like when you're approaching the table saw. Always, what I like to do is keep 1 foot forward so that when I'm leaning forward through the cut, again, partly because I'm so short, is to make sure that my balance and my weight stays over my leg so that I'm not actually off balance tipping through the blade, so that I can still hold myself up through the cut. Now, our next most common cut, or I should say our next very common cut that we'll be doing all the time, is cross cutting, which is across the grain. Doesn't matter the dimensions again, cross the grain, cross cut. So the first method that a lot of saws come with is the miter gauge. And you can set it up with an auxiliary fence like this, so you can create a zero clearance cut and reduce the chip out. Again, nothing too complicated here, real straightforward. I keep my hands away from the blade. So with this, when I did the cross cut, the final cut ended up, or the off cut ended up about here. So what do I do in that situation? I turn off the saw and I wait for the blade to stop before I reach in to clear the piece. This is a crosscut sled that I'm sure you've seen a million of them online on YouTube channels and whatnot, in magazines, etc. These are, or the sled is my favorite method of cross cutting. It's super accurate if built right. And I do have a video on how I built this sled. I'll link that below in the description. And this is the most accurate sled I've ever built, so I'm real excited about that. But this gives you an opportunity to safely hold large pieces, both in depth and in length. And it gives you more room and easier and more stable support where you can put stop blocks for repeated cuts. So if I have a bunch of parts that I need to make all the same length, I set a stop block and make my cuts. When cross-cutting, we do need to take into consideration whether a board is warped or not. In this case, the board has a curve on the edge. You want to make sure that your piece is contacting where the blade is going to be cutting. You want gaps at the ends. You don't want it the opposite way with the gap in the middle. And this is because when you make the cut in this orientation, when you get to the back of the cut, the board will collapse against your fence and it'll pinch in the middle of the blade or the back of the blade. Again, that becomes unpredictable and you're not sure if the workpiece will move or get thrown in any way. The next kind of warp we have to keep an eye out for is a bow. And here again, if we have a gap at the blade, that's bad because it means when you go through the cut, once again, your board is going to collapse down against your sled or the tabletop. And again, it will pinch the blade. So we want to flip the board over and make sure that the board is contacting where the blade is cutting, and that will help keep you safe. Another way that you can make repetitive cuts on a miter gauge or a table saw sled is using a stop block against your fence. When doing this method, you want to make sure that by the time your workpiece touches the front tooth, that you are clear of this block on the back side of your workpiece. You want to make sure that this is free. If you just used it against the fence, there's potential for your fence grabbing, and again, that can cause a kickback. So let's say you need to cut really small parts. Well, the sled is great for this kind of operation, and there's a fast and easy way to do this safely. Now ignore the fact that I have a different blade on here. This is a ripping blade, but assume we have the right blade on here. All we have to do is grab something that we have left over, hold our workpiece down, and we can safely make this cut. Now, I wanted to include this type of cut because this is a cut that you should avoid, and that's where you have a narrow board and it's really long and you think, well, it still's within the fence's range of use, so hey, let's just cut it like this and keep it, simple. I don't want to grab my sled. I don't want to do any other setup. But you want to avoid this because this is such a narrow surface against the fence, and you have so much leverage that even the force of just being pushed against the cutting action of the blade can pull it away from the fence. Now that's an exaggeration, but it can pull it away from the fence, push this back corner into the back of the blade, and again, you can get a kickback. So avoid this kind of cut. Now let's get into other common types of cuts that you might be making on the table saw. This one here is what you might use if you were cutting 10 ends. And this is a jig that you can buy jigs like this pre-manufactured and everything. This is a design that's been around for a real long time. Or you can make one that just like I've done. And this just rides in the miter slot. And with your board on end, you want to have security and support, again, so that you can't tip it back and forth on the blade, for safety that way, but also because it'll hold your workpiece steady, stable, and give you a nice clean cut. And one thing you should keep in mind when doing this cut, you'll notice that I haven't cut the shoulder cut, meaning I haven't cut across the grain this way yet. And that means that when I make this cut, I won't have this tiny little piece floating between the jig and the blade. Again, another little piece that could be thrown and could also actually knock your workpiece off of where it's supposed to be, and it could ruin the cut. Another method that you could use to make this cut is a simple jig like this, that all it is two boards put together at a 90 degrees, giving yourself a long flat surface as well as a tall surface to be able to ride across the fence. Here I've made a hole for a clamp. And then you just push it through. Again, this helps keep the workpiece stable, although it's not as stable as a jig riding in the miter gauge, or what you might call a saddle sled, one that wraps around your table saw fence and allows it to slide trapped on the fence. Another common cut is making a rabbet. And for this cut, I'll need to remove my splitter. And this is perfectly safe in most cases, especially with a shallow cut. When you get into deeper cuts, your blade can get pinched, so you got to watch out for that. But on shallow cuts like this, for a rabbet, I do the edge cut first. So for the next part of this process, we need to cut away at a 90 degree the second portion of this cut. Now, there's a right way and a wrong way to do this. The wrong way is to put your workpiece against the fence and make this cut and trap that little off cut in between the blade and the fence. This will give you a situation where you potentially could have that little teeny piece be shot back right behind you. The safer way to make this cut is to allow the workpiece, or excuse me, where you allow the scrap piece to fall free on the left-hand side of the blade. So as we kind of saw on that last cut, the rabbit cut, that there are cuts where you have to remove your splitter. And a non-through cut, let's say you're just cutting a groove, meaning non-through as in not cutting through the entire workpiece. Again, that can be safely done. You just got to keep in mind the other principles we talked about with where your hands are pushing, how close they are to the blade. But most of the time this will be safe, and most of the time you're not in danger of any kind of kickback because your workpiece that's not being cut is holding that kerf open. Another cut that you might be wanting to make is a 45-degree angle, let's say for a picture frame. So this is a sled that I've made for 45s. I actually need to remake it. It's not a design that I particularly like. And one of the things that you need to keep in mind with this kind of cut, just like with cross cutting, which I didn't mention, is the lateral forces of the blade. Meaning as you're cutting through, especially on miter cuts, you may notice that the forces involved when cutting may actually push your workpiece away from the blade through the cut. So it's recommended that you clamp it down securely when possible. So here you can see this is just a short piece. And there you have it, you know, real straightforward. But a better way to make this cut, not only will this work for short pieces, but this helps with longer pieces, is making a jig that allows you to use clamping pressure. And this downward clamping pressure could be done with a toggle clamp such as this. And my next sled for this purpose, I want to make with this feature. And that will help fight the forces that want to push it away from the blade, and if it's a long piece, it'll help keep it securely down against your sled. So another cut is the bevel cut, and this is where you tilt your table saw blade to your desired bevel. Now when doing this, on saws that have zero clearance insert plates, you need to have your own separate dedicated bevel throat plate, because you need to cut in at an angle into the back of your throat plate. And again, your best practice here is to have the offcut, or the waste rather, fall on the opposite side of where the fence is. Another type of bevel cut you may want to make is a low angle, like let's say a 15-degree angle bevel cut on panels that you're using to make raised panels for raised panel doors and such. In that case, you've got large boards that could be very tippy. And once again, I really recommend making a jig, again, probably a saddle sled, that attaches to your fence. In my case, again, my fence would be on this side of the blade for that cut. And that way you can clamp it to that sled, hold it securely, make sure it doesn't tip through the cut. And that way you'll not only be safer that way, but you'll get a nice, clean, smooth cut, and it'll give you a better result in the end anyway. And lastly, I'd like to talk about using stacked dado head cutters. So let's say you're wanting to make a tall cut through a board because you want to make something that has interlocking dividers in it. Here's a cut where I recommend that you never try to make it in one pass. Dado heads are meat cutters. They will just grind up flesh like it's nothing, and that flesh will be gone. So I say this kind of cut is bad, but it can be done if you nibble away at it a little bit at a time. But as with anything, the more blade exposed, the more alert you need to be, and be very careful with that kind of cut. So never make a really deep cut with a stacked dado head all in one pass. Now let's say we're doing a standard dado where we're making this cut partially through a workpiece. Now all the principles that we've talked about with all other types of cuts apply to this as well. And so with that in mind, use your best judgment, but I highly recommend using push blocks for this. Keeps your hand away from the blade. You can put pressure right over the cut, and it's much safer than, say, just using your hand. Because again, the principle of what happens if your workpiece suddenly disappears. Where's your hand? I say for dado cuts, use push blocks. Now, let's say we want to make a rabbit cut. That's where we pick up a scrap piece of plywood or something like that, and we use it as an auxiliary fence. This way we don't grind into the face of our fence, and it gives us an opportunity to create our rabbit. Once again, I say use push blocks, and on the back end of the cut, to prevent chip out, you can use a backer board, and push blocks help hold that. Well, there you have it, my take on table saw safety. Of course, I'm sure there's other techniques that I haven't touched on, maybe some more advanced techniques, but I'm hoping that what I showed today in this video at least gives you a good foundation where you have some knowledge, something to hold on to, some guidelines and practices that you can utilize when you're getting into using your table saw, or maybe if you're really experienced, you've seen something that might even help you out, even though maybe you've been doing this for decades. And, this is something that I've been doing professionally for 10 years. And these practices have really given me a level of comfort in the sense that, I know that I'm respecting the dangers involved with the table saw, and they've kept me safe day in and day out thus far. I hope that you guys found this video helpful, and I'll see you next time.